Good day. Today is Sunday, 25th January 2026. And before I proceed with this program, let me remind you again, if once you've watched this program, if you like the program, to remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Well, over the last couple of hours, we have seen what I think is a fairly typical picture emerge after the meeting in Abu Dhabi. The Ukrainians say quite a lot. The Americans say quite a lot. The Russians say absolutely nothing at all. Now, almost certainly there was an agreement between the Russians, the Americans, and the Ukrainians that there would be no disclosure of any information following the Abu Dhabi meeting of what was discussed there. The Russians always insist on that kind of confidentiality. Peskov, Putin's spokesman, talks about this all the time, and this was not just a Russian tradition, but of course it was also a Soviet tradition. The United States has a completely different ideas about news management, and so does Ukraine. So inevitably, even as the Russians tell us nothing or virtually nothing, the Americans and the Ukrainians tell us quite a lot. But of course, it is always essential to understand that a lot, even if in itself it is not wrong or inaccurate, nonetheless does usually contain a very high level of spinning. Now, I am not going to focus on what the Ukrainians have been saying. As far as I can see, they've been adding very little to the information that the Americans have been providing. It would be fair to say that the Americans and the Ukrainians both accept that there have been no breakthroughs, no changes in fundamental positions. The Russians haven't rowed back on any of their demands, and certainly didn't do so over the course of the talks in Abu Dhabi. So this has been what the Americans and the Russians have, the Americans and the Ukrainians have conceded. The Russians have stuck to their positions. In fact, as we shall see, there's no reason to think at the moment that they might not even have hardened them in the long term. The Russians, for their part, in the only comment they have made about what happened during the discussions, were made by one of the participants to the official Russian state news agency TASS. This person, whoever he was, said that it would not be true to say that there had been no results. In other words, a double negative, which suggests that though something was discussed and there were some results, these were very, very modest in character indeed. And if we go to what the Americans are saying, well, we can see that that conforms pretty much to this one single comment we've had from the Russians. So let's go to what the Americans have been saying. And it's been said by two officials who've spoken to the US media. As far as I can see, the best accounts of what these two officials said come from Axios and Politico. Two officials, could it be Kushner and Witkoff? We are told that they spoke anonymously. It might have been Kushner and Witkoff, but then again, Kushner and Witkoff have been traveling in the Middle East. Perhaps they are otherwise engaged. It might have been someone else. I'm not going to speculate or waste more time speculating. There's no doubt that these were authorized leaks by the US administration. And of course, we have the usual optimistic spin about what was discussed. There's progress, Putin and Zelensky might eventually meet, but this, of course, depends on more progress being made. It could be that at some point in the not so distant future, the negotiations will be conducted alternatively in Kiev or Moscow. As we will say, what actually came out of the discussions in Abu Dhabi in no way warrants those predictions, even based on what these officials are telling us. So let's put all that aside and look at the more interesting points that they're making. And first, let's begin with Axios. Axios says that it took several months for the White House to convince the Russians and Ukrainians to hold trilateral talks with US mediation. First of all, is that really true? Is it actually true that it took several months for the White House to convince the Russians and Ukrainians to hold trilateral talks? Well, the short answer is it isn't true, and we know that this isn't true because the Russians have never refused to speak with the Ukrainians, and they've always been happy to speak with the Americans as well, and the idea of trilateral meetings have been floated, and the Russians have never rejected them. The Ukrainians, however, have consistently done so. Back in either September or October 2022, Zelensky signed a decree which, by the way, remains in place. He has never withdrawn it, saying that no Ukrainian official can meet and conduct negotiations with any Russian official. So he insists that he refuses to revoke this decree. It remains in place. But anyway, back in the autumn of 2022, he was saying that there should be no negotiations with the Russians at all until the Russians withdraw completely from all Ukrainian territory being the territory that Ukraine possessed after it became independent. Ukrainian territory, therefore, including Donbass, all of Zaporizhzhia, all of Kherson region, and all of Crimea. And that remained Zelensky's position until March of last year. Until March of 2025, Zelensky was insisting on this. In March of 2025, he very grudgingly agreed to a ceasefire on the existing conflict lines, though this only happened after the Americans briefly cut, or partially cut, as we now know, the supply of intelligence to the Ukrainians and froze all further weapons deliveries to the Ukrainians. And even then, it was not Zelensky who conceded the idea of a ceasefire. It was his chief of staff, Andrei Yermak, who met with the Americans in, I think it was Jeddah, and the Americans basically used the third degree to get Yermak and the Ukrainians to agree to a ceasefire on the existing conflict line, a proposal rejected by the Russians and dropped by President Trump, first after his meeting with the Russians in Anchorage and then again in recent weeks. But anyway, let's not get sidetracked with that. And then even after agreeing to a ceasefire, and very grudgingly, Zelensky continued to say that he did not want meetings with the Russians and said that if there were going to be meetings with the Russians, he and he alone should conduct those meetings. Vladimir Putin then on the 8th of May, or was it the 9th of May, 2025, last year, said that he would resume the negotiations in Istanbul that began in the spring of 2022, and that he would send negotiators to Istanbul to meet with the Ukrainians there. Zelensky refused. Zelensky said that he would not send negotiators. He then said that he would go to Istanbul himself and meet with Putin one-to-one, and that was the only negotiation that was acceptable to him. And then Putin paid no attention, and Putin's negotiators arrived in Istanbul and were left waiting, and eventually Zelensky, still hoping to meet Putin in Istanbul, apparently turned up in Ankara, where he had a long, many-hour discussion with President Erdogan of Turkey, who also applied the third degree and managed eventually to get Zelensky very grudgingly and very reluctantly to agree to send a team of negotiators to meet with the Russians in Istanbul. And over long intervals of several weeks, these negotiators, the Ukrainian and Russian negotiators, met in Istanbul. The Russian delegation was headed by Vladimir Medinsky, one of Putin's aides. I forget now who headed the Ukrainian delegations. Eventually, the chief negotiator became Rustem Umerov. Anyway, these delegations met. I think it was on 3 occasions. But then, at the end of last year, Zelensky said, his officials said, that the process in Istanbul had gone nowhere, that the Russians were making demands that went beyond a ceasefire, and that was the only thing that he was prepared to discuss, and he called the negotiations entirely off. He has at various times himself said that the only negotiations that he is prepared to contemplate are direct negotiations between himself and Putin, with Trump perhaps also involved too. And Trump at various times has seemed to agree to this. Anyway, the Russians, to repeat, have never rejected direct negotiations with the Ukrainians. On the contrary, they proposed them in the spring of 2022. They conducted them with the Ukrainians throughout the spring and early summer of 2022. Those negotiations, as we know, led to the draft Istanbul Agreement, which was initialed by both sides in April 2022. It was the Ukrainians who then refused to meet. It's the Ukrainians who've been very grudging and unwilling to meet since then. And the Russians have never at any point said that they don't want the Americans involved in the negotiations. In fact, from a Russian point of view, it actually makes sense for the Americans to be involved in the negotiations. Of course, the Americans present this as mediation, as if they were the impartial party between the two sides. But from a Russian point of view, even if it's obvious that the Americans are not mediators, it makes absolute sense to involve them in the negotiations, because the Americans are actually a party to the war. The President of the United States, and even more so, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, have explicitly admitted that this has been a proxy war between the United States and Russia. If there is going to be a negotiation to end that war and to reach a satisfactory solution to the war from a Russian point of view, then it makes absolute sense to talk to the chief party on the other side, which is the United States, and not waste too much time on the proxy, which is Ukraine. As I've discussed many times, it makes much more sense to deal with the organ grinder than to waste time with his monkey. So there we go. So the Russians have never, ever refused negotiations with the Ukrainians. The Russians have never refused to work together in working parties. In fact, as we know, the Russians, at the last meeting that took place in Istanbul between themselves and the Ukrainians, actually suggested working parties. They suggested 3 of them. And Putin repeated this proposal in a call he had with Donald Trump in August of 2025, even as Zelensky and the Europeans were present in the White House. And he again said that there should be 3 working parties. And he again reiterated a Russian proposal that the chief negotiators on the Russian and Ukrainian sides could be upgraded. He didn't propose at that time working parties that would involve the Americans, but there is no reason to think that he would have objected to them for the reasons that I just said. So when we are told that it took several months for the White House to convince the Russians and Ukrainians to hold trilateral talks with US mediation, that is not a strictly accurate statement. It is not factually wrong, but a more correct, a more accurate way to put it would be to say that it has taken several months for the White House to convince the Ukrainians to hold talks with the Russians, with the Americans also involved. This has been actually an incredibly difficult, very protracted affair. There was a very difficult meeting between Trump and Zelensky in September. There was another equally difficult meeting between Trump and Zelensky in November. There were apparently raised voices over the course of both of those meetings. According to some accounts, Zelensky showed Trump maps of the situation on the front lines, and Trump became angry and threw them down and said he was sick of seeing these maps. And as I said, it has been Zelensky who's resisted talks. It's been the Europeans who have been supporting Zelensky in resisting such talks. Zelensky has consistently demanded a ceasefire. He said that there needs to be a ceasefire before talks take place. So this particular sentence, which by the way appears in Axios, is not false exactly, but it is incomplete. It is inaccurate. It suggests that the Americans have worked hard to try to persuade both the Russians and the Ukrainians to conduct negotiations, when the record clearly shows that the obstruction has come overwhelmingly from the Ukrainians. And of course, I think it was about 2 weeks ago that Donald Trump actually said that it was Zelensky who was resisting progress towards any kind of negotiated solution. And by the way, I strongly suspect that American pressure, or perhaps American instructions to Zelensky to agree to the setting up of these tripartite discussions in Abu Dhabi, something which goes totally against everything that Zelensky has been saying since the autumn of 2022 and last year. All of that probably played a part in putting Zelensky in this very, very bad mood that he was in Davos, which resulted in him making that extraordinary speech, that bizarre tirade that I've discussed in a recent program. Now, here I would just make one further point, and I've touched on it already. The Americans, the Ukrainians, and the Russians met in Abu Dhabi, and we will discuss the format and the nature of the discussions in a moment. But who conspicuously was not there? The Europeans were not there. They have repeatedly said that they should be involved in the discussions. They've talked about this constantly. They've complained vociferously when they are not invited to the table. Well, they were not invited to the table in Abu Dhabi. They've been completely excluded from the talks. They've said absolutely nothing about it. They have grudgingly, however unhappily, accepted the fact that they are no longer wanted by the Americans and, of course, by the Russians in these negotiations at all. The Europeans, by the way, continue to be in a hopeless mess. They have said to each other, and have been saying to each other for about a month now, that it's time for them to appoint a chief negotiator to speak with the Russians. But as I've discussed many times, they haven't got past first base. They haven't even yet agreed on who that person will be. And at the moment, it looks extremely unlikely that they will agree on such a person at any proximate point of time. So what did they discuss in Abu Dhabi? What did the Americans, the Russians, and the Ukrainians actually discuss in Abu Dhabi? Well, we are told about this in both by Politico and by Axios, based upon what these two unnamed US officials briefed them. These talks were about de-escalation. One of the US officials said. That's in Politico. And Axios puts it somewhat more elaborately. It says that US officials said that all the issues were discussed. Notice the word all the issues were discussed. And then he throws in the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which I'll come to in a moment. But then he says that they discussed what kind of de-escalation steps will be needed from both sides to make it clear that the war is over and will not resume. So de-escalation, and Politico says that the major part of the discussion, that the talks were again about de-escalation, and that appears to be a direct quote. De-escalation of what exactly? The Russians are continuing their energy strikes, their strikes against Ukraine's energy system. They conducted one of their biggest and single most powerful strike of the war on Kiev and on Kiev's energy system, hours after the meetings in Abu Dhabi ended. As I've already pointed out, if you go back to what Ushakov said following his meeting with Witkoff and Kushner in Moscow a couple of days ago, it seemed to me, reading between the lines, that Putin rejected an energy truce, which other reports in the media had suggested the Americans were going to propose. So no very visible sign of de-escalation from the Russian side. The war goes on. The attacks continue. So what sort of de-escalation is being talked about in that case. If we're talking about de-escalation of the situation. Now, well, could it be that one of the items that was discussed was drone attacks on the residence of the Russian president, attempts to assassinate him? After all, we are told by Axios that all the issues were discussed. Well, I am absolutely sure that that was a topic that was discussed. The Russians said this must never happen again. I don't know what the Ukrainians said. I don't know what the Americans said. I don't know whether the Ukrainians and the Americans agreed or whether they retreated into the denials that any such attack took place. But anyway, it looks to me as if de-escalation has to cover events like that. And to repeat again, Politico says that the talks were about de-escalation. So there was a lot of other things discussed too. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The Russians said that they would be happy to sell or supply Ukraine with electricity from the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. But they never said otherwise. In fact, they made that offer, to my knowledge, several times already. There is absolutely nothing new there. The way Axios describes it is that the dispute, there was a dispute over the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and that there were suggestions concerning the joint supply of electricity, both for Russia and Ukraine, from the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. But no suggestion here that the Russians are prepared to cede control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant either to Ukraine or to the United States, or that they're prepared to share control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant with either of those two countries. Had the Russians been prepared to concede something like that, I have no doubt that the two US officials would have said it. And so it looks as if, at best, the Russians are prepared to supply some electricity from the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant to Ukraine once a peace settlement is agreed. And they've said that before, so I don't see there that anything very much has changed. And of course, undoubtedly, there was talk about other things, talk about how any cessation of hostilities would be regulated and that kind of thing. And there was probably a lot of discussion about the mechanics of all of that. And that is, of course, what working parties of this kind are set up to do. We're not talking here about a ceasefire in advance of a final settlement. It's preparing the ground for that substantive negotiation on the political issues to take place, which will end in a final settlement of the war, following which a cessation of the hostilities will take place. So a lot of that sort of thing, no doubt, discussed. Talk about monitoring of lines after the fighting ends, and that kind of thing, the kind of thing that military officials talk about. And it is important, and it's good that these discussions are taking place, but one shouldn't expect that necessarily, well, that in any way, in fact, amounts to any kind of concession on the Russian positions. The Russians, throughout the meeting, apparently made clear that the Ukrainians must withdraw completely from Donbass. I expect that if the Ukrainians withdraw from Donbass, at the next meeting, the Russians will demand that the Ukrainians must withdraw from Zaporizhzhia region and from Kherson regions as well. So, anyway, some progress in that regard. And perhaps another interesting fact about the meeting, we've now had a photo. It's now clear that the meetings did take place in a plenary format. We see the various delegations sitting in a U-shaped table, a horseshoe-shaped table. The Ukrainians and the Russians facing each other, the Americans in the middle. The Americans, by the way, very casually dressed. The Russians and the Ukrainians, well, certainly the Russians, somewhat less so the Ukrainians, much more formally dressed, as one would expect. The point is that that kind of format is what you would expect from a working party. So it goes beyond the proposals, the discussions that took place, the format that I expected and suggested yesterday, of the Russians meeting the Americans and the Americans passing on Russian ideas to the Ukrainians and vice versa. It looks like an actual meeting with all three parties present. And by the way, as a former mediator, I should say that that is not the format that one expects in a mediation setting. This is a format of an actual negotiation in which the parties to the conflict, implicitly, including the United States itself, are directly participating in the negotiation. So the Americans are now participating, not just as mediators. They may say that they are mediators, but as I said, they are physically present in the room. The fact that they are physically present in the room and at the working lunch, which followed the plenary sessions, and working lunches, by the way, are absolutely standard in negotiations of this kind. In effect, it identifies the Americans as a party. If you follow the history of the Vietnam War, you will know that the format of the negotiations that took place in Paris was similar. There was a huge amount of debate and argument and discussion about the layout of the table and who would sit where. It took 6 months of discussions in the late 1960s before the format between the North Vietnamese, the Americans, and the South Vietnamese was finally agreed. But of course it was agreed. The point was that the Americans were there, they were involved in the discussions, and of course whatever fiction existed at that time, I don't know that there was, by the way, any pretense about this, that this was a discussion between the Vietnamese, the North and the South Vietnamese, quickly fell away. It became increasingly obvious that it became a discussion between the North Vietnamese and the Americans. So the Americans are now directly engaged in the negotiations. That is what this photograph shows, and this, I think, is something that the Russians probably quietly would welcome. There is something else, and this comes from Politico, and it is very interesting because we are told in Politico that there was a lot of discussions, or rather that there were controversies about security guarantees. The Russians clearly unhappy about the way in which the Americans have been talking about security guarantees with the Europeans and with the Ukrainians. And of course, there was also clearly some discussion about the role of Starmer's and Macron's so-called coalition of the willing. And here it seems to me the Americans are gradually going to move towards dropping the idea of a European peacekeeping force as cobbled together, floated repeatedly by Macron and Starmer entirely. We read that a US official on Saturday, one of the two officials, appeared to dismiss these European commitments, noting that it is American security guarantees that are most critical. The coalition of the willing efforts are nice. They had a couple of helicopters and a couple of troops and a couple of guarantees here and there. But if you speak to the Ukrainians, it's really the American security guarantee that matters. So, very dismissive of what Macron and Starmer are proposing. So dismissive, in fact, that I can't help but think that if it was up to this particular American official, and it might be Witkoff and it might be Kushner, he would drop this whole idea of a European deployment entirely. It's going to be decided by the Americans and the Russians. The Americans are not going to let the Europeans get in the way, and they're not going to let Macron's and Starmer's follies about European troop deployments, which are obviously intended to draw the Americans more deeply in than they want to be, that the Americans are not going to let that get in their way of any negotiated solution that they're interested in. So, there it is. That's my take of what these two American officials have said. To repeat again, there's been no substantial compromise, no concessions of any kind at all from the Russian side. There was talk of de-escalation, but there is no sign of de-escalation by the Russians, and the Russians seem to have rejected any proposals of de-escalation from their side before the talks. I suspect that to the extent that there was de-escalation, it was demands for de-escalation from the Ukrainians and the Americans, a cessation of the kind of attacks that we saw take place on Valdai. But, of course, what might be said, what might be agreed in the format of these particular talks might have very little bearing indeed on what actually happens on the ground. And I, for one, find it all but impossible to imagine that the US intelligence community, that part of the US intelligence community that remains committed to this program and to Project Ukraine, is going to give up a tool like this, and I suspect that they will continue to press on with it. I'm going to make one further point here, which is that, in my opinion, if we're talking about negotiations, this is the point when the negotiations actually start. We've had a whole year, 2025, wasted on various proposals and counter-proposals that have gone into far too much detail. There are various American plans and European plans, none of which had any prospect of being accepted by the Russians. the Kellogg plan, Zelensky's 20-point plan, the various proposals that the Europeans, Starmer and Macron and the coalition of the willing have put forward. All of these were basically unilateral offers which the Russians were certain to reject. This is a kind of negotiation we saw in Abu Dhabi of a sort that we've never had at any point in the conflict before. The discussions that took place over the course of the summer in Istanbul might have evolved into something like the negotiations we are seeing take place in Abu Dhabi. But in light of Zelensky's intransigence, it was inevitable that without the Americans, the discussions in Istanbul would become ultimately performative. The Ukrainians continuing to demand things like unconditional ceasefires, which the Russians have already rejected, and that process would eventually run into the ground. Finally, we have a negotiation with negotiating teams. The American negotiating team is very ragged and very incomplete, but it does include people like Driscoll and Grinkiewicz, who are the kind of people that you would expect to be involved in a negotiation of this kind. The Ukrainian team includes people like Budanov, Skibitsky, and Gnatov, the chief of staff. And when the parties meet and talk with each other, this is how the way forward in a serious negotiation can eventually be found. So, in effect, what we now have is a direct negotiation between the Americans and the Russians seeking to end the conflict in Ukraine. The first small step in that direction has been made in Abu Dhabi. I would hope that from this point going forward, the figures, the personalities of Witkoff and Kushner will fade, and that people like Driscoll and others of that kind will start to play a larger role. It was Putin who discussed how we needed strong negotiating teams to take the process forward, both from the Russian side and from the American side. And perhaps, just possibly, that is what is about to happen. Now, it is going to take a very long time, many meetings, many months of meetings, before any significant progress is made. Probably more than 8 months. It's debatable whether Ukraine has those 8 months, as we will see. But a small step does seem to have been made, and we'll see where it leads. Now, why is the United States doing this, and why are the Russians going along with it? There is undoubtedly a current of opinion in Moscow that says, is a negotiation with the Americans of any kind worthwhile? Russia is winning the war. Its forces are advancing. It is hammering Ukraine every day. And of course, as the Russians have had good reasons to know, the Americans absolutely cannot be trusted. Well, perhaps the explanation for this has to be looked at America's overall position, as it's been revealed to some extent, at least, by these two documents that have appeared over the last couple of weeks, the Security Strategy Review document and the new Pentagon strategy document that was released 2 days ago, and which I read carefully over the last couple of hours. The last document, by the way, the Pentagon document is very short. And again, I know that there is enormous cynicism about these two documents and what they actually mean, and whether they do indeed mean a retrenchment by the United States into its own hemisphere, or whether they are in effect intended to prepare the ground for a renewed American attempt to achieve global dominance. Well, the thing to say, beyond what these two documents say, is to look at the overall American position, which both documents, particularly the Pentagon document, discuss, even though they discuss it fairly briefly. The fact is that the United States is under stress. Its economy is overextended. The various efforts that have been made over the last 8 years to increase manufacturing have been unsuccessful. Manufacturing, overall output in US manufacturing industry continues to fall. It's been suggested that the enormous increase in the Pentagon budget that the Trump administration is talking about for next year, an increase in the budget from a mere $900 billion a year to $1.5 trillion is intended as a mechanism to revive American industry. In other words, it's an attempt to invest in American industry in order to trigger an industrial revival, such as the one the United States supposedly achieved in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan, and the one that the United States undoubtedly did achieve in the 1940s during the Second World War. Well, no doubt, as I said, those plans do exist, but the reality is that industrial production, manufacturing production, has been falling, and the United States can be in no doubt that its overall position of economic dominance is eroding. The Pentagon paper frankly admits that the economic challenge posed by China is greater than any such challenge that the United States has come up against since the 19th century, when, of course, the United States had not yet established the unprecedented economic dominance that it achieved in the middle years of the 20th century. And, of course, the US military itself is overextended and overstretched. Both documents talk about the fact that the United States has frittered away its power in unimportant wars or less important wars, most of which have not achieved the objectives of their promoters. There's been much trouble with the US military, which many people have spoken about. The army is relatively small and overextended, and the number of available divisions that can be deployed at any one place at any one time is less than 10. The US Navy is still very strong in aircraft carriers and destroyers, but it is competing against a massive Chinese shipbuilding program, which the United States is unable to match. And the US lead in underwater warfare, in submarines, is eroding, though the two documents don't mention it, because of Russia's advances in submarine technology with the Yasen class, the Borei class, and of course the new Poseidon submarine drones and other submarine drones that are also appearing. So the US military is overextended. The US economy is overextended. And gradually, in fact, not so gradually anymore, the United States is losing its lock grip over the global financial system, is slipping. There's a very good article about all of this, which you can find on Larry Johnson's Sonar 21 blog, which discusses the position of the US dollar and of the reserve currency system. So the United States is not unaware of all of this. There are many people in the United States who talk about these questions, and some of the discussions have reached the highest levels of the US government itself. And given these stresses, it's becoming unsurprising that there are voices that are starting to grow in strength within the United States, which say that the priority now should be to preserve US primacy. In other words, the US position as the world's leading great power, rather than pursue outright global dominance, which is what the United States launched into after the Second World War, and especially after the end of the Cold War. That the resources to do that are no longer there. The challenges are too great. Primacy must be preserved, and that is now the overriding priority. And the Pentagon document talks about setting priorities, and the major priority is to ensure the US homeland, the defense of the US homeland, and to ensure the US's dominant position in the Western Hemisphere, and to understand that in other places the United States cannot be as strong as it once was. In a famous comment, sometimes attributed to Frederick the Great, he who seeks to defend everywhere defends nothing. Perhaps one should correct that in the case of the United States. If the United States seeks at the same time, simultaneously, to be strong everywhere, then it will be strong nowhere. And rather cold-bloodedly and rather ruthlessly, given that the major challenge to US primacy is coming from China, the United States focuses on the place where China is situated, which is the Asia Pacific. It says that within a few years, more than half of the the global economy will be located in Asia. This is the place where the United States must continue to be strong, and it accepts that defeating China is no longer possible. As Arnaud Bertrand, in his invaluable Substack blog, correctly points out, this document, this latest Pentagon document, is remarkable in that it no longer even mentions Taiwan, for example. So it perhaps even prepares for the day when Taiwan is going to be thrown under the Chinese bus. Just saying. But anyway, the United States needs to be strong in Asia, and it needs to control its own hemisphere. And that, by the way, and this document says it explicitly, must mean control of Greenland. And as for Europe, well, it can take care of itself. Interestingly enough, the article, this strategy paper, concedes that Russia is a great power, that its success in the war, the conflict in Ukraine, confirms that Russia has depths of military and economic resources, which implicitly this doctrine paper acknowledges. People in the United States, in Washington, a few years ago, didn't realize that Russia had. But it assumes that because China is the greater rival to US primacy, the situation with Russia needs to be dialed down, and that is the kind of change of stance that the United States can safely make. And in my program yesterday, I spoke about the letter of the Roman Emperor, the Emperor Honorius, to the British cities. It was actually in 410 AD, as somebody correctly pointed out, even as the problems of the Roman Empire were increasing, as they were intensifying, as the Visigoths were moving on Rome. The emperor wrote to the British cities saying that they could no longer look to the central government in Rome for protection. Henceforth, they would have to protect themselves. And this paper actually says exactly that to the Europeans, that the United States now has to focus on its own hemisphere. It has to focus on the Asia-Pacific region. The Russians are indeed very strong, but they're not so strong that the Europeans by themselves can't sort things out with them. And the article, this doctrinal paper, makes a claim, says something which is partially wrong, and in one particular, completely wrong. It says that strong as the Russians are, Europe in aggregate is stronger, at least its latent strength, it's greater, its aggregate population is greater than Russia's, which of course is true if you assume that all of the various European countries can work together as one, and you speak of Europe as a single population bloc, which is of course wrong, just saying, and that its economy is greater than Russia's, much greater than Russia's, which is also true, again, if you assume that Europe, again, functions as a single unified economic bloc. Well, there's been many attempts to make that happen over the last 50 years, and far from being successful, what that has done, as Alex and I have discussed in many programs on the Duran, is that it has drained vitality out of the European economy, triggering the crisis in Europe, which we now see. But then it makes a third comment, which is an absolutely false and almost absurdly false. It says that the German economy dwarfs Russia, which in purchasing power parity terms, which is the only metric, by the way, that matters, is not only wrong, it is completely wrong. It is the Russian economy that is much bigger than Germany's. The IMF, the World Bank say as much, and the gap is continuing to grow, and it is growing continuously in Russia's favour. And of course, it's not just a case of the Russian economy being significantly bigger than the German, but anybody who looks at the situation and compares the two countries today and does so with any degree of objectivity would not, I think, dispute that at this particular time The Russian economy is not only in financially far better shape, with a very much lower debt to GDP ratio, but it is also much better run and has far greater resources, which promise for much more sustained growth in the future. But of course, the reason this document says all of these things is because what it is basically telling the Europeans is, look, we can't be here any longer. We can't be in Europe any longer. The time has come for us to leave. You've got to look after yourselves. All of you taken together are stronger than the Russians. The Russians are not 10 foot tall. Even Germany could take on the Russians by itself. So you don't need us, and we're going to go away, and we're going to retreat into our hemisphere, at least in the West. We will take steps, obviously, to protect the North Atlantic. That's what the Greenland affair, to me, looks all about. But our focus from now on has to be the Asia-Pacific and dealing with China. And, well, we've had further commentaries appearing in parts of the American media over the last couple of hours, which speak about the United States wanting to work towards finding some means of sorting out the issues between Europe and the Russians. The Americans know perfectly well that in reality there is an imbalance of power, and that imbalance of power is in Russia's favour, despite what their strategy papers say. And since they want peace and quiet in Europe so that they can focus on China and the Asia Pacific, well, what they want is the Europeans and the Russians to sit down and come to some kind of agreements, some sort of arrangements with each other to preserve the peace of Europe in the long term. Anyway, that's what these documents say, and that is what is being discussed in Washington. And if you look at the actual power realities, it's logical. It makes sense. It aligns with the actual realities of American power at this time. America's power relatively has declined, so it has to set priorities for itself. China is the priority, Russia is not. Europe is less important than it used to be, and it can take care of itself, and it needs to sort out its own problems with the Russians, and the Russians and the Americans want that to happen and to facilitate it. It is the exact opposite, incidentally, of what the Biden administration was trying to do. The Biden administration wanted to make relations between the Europeans and the Russians as bad as possible, in which, by the way, it was extraordinarily successful. The Americans, having achieved that success, are now left with the broken pieces across the board and conscious of the fact that the war in Ukraine is being lost, but having also to worry about the Asia Pacific and the Chinese. They now want to put some of those pieces together again in the hope that that will buy them time in Europe, prevent the Russians from doing things in Europe, which the Americans might feel obliged to do something about, so that the United States can find time to deal with the conflict with the Chinese in the Asia Pacific region. That, at any rate, is the thinking, and I think it is the thinking of some people in Washington. It is certainly the thinking of some people in the Pentagon and in the White House and in the larger expert community, and it reflects American diplomatic moves, the sort of people who are conducting the negotiations, the outreach to the Russians over the last year. People like Dan Driscoll, for example, are those people who think in this way. Of course, not everyone in the United States thinks in this way. There remains the Kagan-Nuland school, which remains passionately hostile to Russia and wholly invested in Europe, continues to argue that since Russia is the weaker adversary, it must be the one that must be overturned and weakened first. They're the people who talk to Seymour Hersh and still plot assassination attempts against Putin and things of that kind. They are still there. They haven't gone away. In the United States, in the US system, nobody ever goes away. These factions are always there, and they always endure. And there is no final victory of one over the other, which explains, by the way, why the United States is incapable in the end of sticking with the kind of strategies that these two strategy papers have outlined. But in the meantime, in the short term, the people who are committed to the policies set out in these papers are more in the ascendant than their rivals. That's why the negotiations with the Russians are taking place at all. And that's why we've had the meeting in Abu Dhabi. And that's why the Americans, who, by the way, have resisted all suggestions up to now that they negotiate directly with the Russians about the ending of the conflict in Ukraine, who wanted to avoid appearing a party in the negotiations. That's why the Americans have now, in effect, joined the negotiations as an actual belligerent party, because they understand that despite the brave words that have appeared in this latest strategy paper, the Europeans are weak, and if anything is to be done in Europe to buy the United States time so that it can reconfigure itself, that has to be done by negotiations with the Russians. Now, the Russians read all of these papers. They read what Seymour Hersh is writing. They read what these two strategy papers say. They've, of course, met with Witkoff and Kushner. They've met with other US officials. Ryabkov, the deputy foreign minister, who remains the hardliner in the foreign ministry in all dealings with the Americans. Anyway, he's said that in terms of resolving the problems between the US and Russia directly, that's all stagnating. There's no resolution of the problems with the embassies. There's no return of Russian property in the United States seized under the Obama administration. Negotiations on a New START treaty are nowhere in sight, and we are now just a week or so, 2 weeks away from the expiry of the START treaty and open season for weapons, for strategic nuclear arms races, and all of that sort of thing. So the Russians know all about this, but they also know that they're winning in Ukraine. They sense that the Americans, in Europe at least, are becoming weaker. And they're using the negotiations to press their advantage. And over the course of the negotiations, as the situation in Ukraine changes, this is of course assuming the negotiations don't completely break down, which is by no means impossible, the balance of advantage will tilt further to the Russians, and the price they will exact will be higher and higher still. So this is where we are. It would have been much better if we'd had meetings like the one that took place in Abu Dhabi 10 months ago, shortly after President Trump became president. But notice that the Europeans, who were vociferous soon after Trump became president, complaining that the Americans were cutting out Europe in their dealings with the Russians, are now saying nothing. They're not objecting to the meeting in Abu Dhabi at all. The hawks in Congress, in the Senate, are barely talking about this either. They talk about massive, bone-crushing sanctions against Russia. Again, appears to be melting away. Maybe we had to go through all that year, all the nonsense of this last year, 2025, the Kellogg plan, the variations of the Kellogg plan, in order to arrive at this point. But to repeat again, it's been left very late, and in the meantime, the war goes on. And, well, the Russians continue their strikes on Ukraine. Zelensky today complained that since January, every week, since the start of the year, every week has seen more and more powerful Russian strikes. The Military Summary Channel did an interesting count of the thermal power stations working in Kiev, and it found that 4 out of 5 were no longer in operation. It said that this means that Kiev still has one operating power station. Well, you could say that that's, instead of saying that the cup is 4/5 empty, it is 1/5 full. Just saying. There are reports that the Russians are about to strike at the transformers, the substations, the electricity substations that link Ukraine to the 3 remaining nuclear power plants. So that's possibly about to come. The reports suggest that the defences of Konstantinovka, where I think the most intense fighting currently is taking place, that the defences of Konstantinovka are now collapsing, and that the Russians are in control of a significant part of the town, though it's not easy for me to work out how much. The Russians, back in December, said that they control 55% of the buildings and 40% of the territory. The mapping projects still show significantly less of the territory than 40%. But my sense is that we are probably going to get to that point fairly soon, even if we have not reached it yet. Just saying. And, well, it seems that General Teplinsky's troops continue to work their way round towards the attacks on Oreshnik and Zaporizhzhia city that are likely to come very soon. And Chernigov continues to be without power. Odessa continues to be hammered. The cities across Ukraine remain in a very bleak and very bad condition. And I suspect that more and more people are leaving them. Anyway, I remain of the view that all of this is preparatory to the big Russian offensive, and I think we are now going to be talking about a big Russian offensive, as I discussed in a recent program. The Russian Ministry of Defense is finally talking about active offensive operations conducted by Group of Forces Center north of Pakrovsk. So the word offensive is starting to appear in Russian Defense Ministry bulletins, and I think this is very indicative. So anyway, I think that a big Russian offensive almost certainly is coming, and the talks in Abu Dhabi, assuming that they do resume next weekend, are not going to prevent that, just as they haven't prevented the strikes on the Ukrainian cities, which the Americans are no longer complaining about. The Ukrainians perhaps ought to be drawing the political conclusions of what this means. Logically, they ought to be sending their own representatives to meet with the Russians. They ought to be seeking to meet with the Russians themselves now, to try and find some way that the war can be ended, even if that means major concessions to the Russians, going far beyond the concessions the Ukrainians made back in Istanbul. But of course the Ukrainians aren't doing that, and to be honest, I don't think they will. It's taken a huge effort by the Americans to get them to this point of negotiating with the Russians at all, and it's only happened because the Americans themselves are negotiating with the Russians. They're no longer talking about Kellogg plans or anything of that kind. They're no longer even talking about 28 points or anything of that kind. And we will see where all this goes. Anyway, that's the situation in Ukraine. I'm going to finish this program by talking about the Oreshnik situation, because I've had an email from one of the commentators who's been discussing the Oreshnik situation, and I found it most interesting, and it was a response to the comments made by Professor Postol. And again, I found these points very, very interesting and very convincing indeed. Now, this commentator, who is an extremely serious and erudite person, made it clear that he and Professor Postol are working within the same laws of physics. There's no direct disagreement or argument with them on things like that. He did make the point that when Professor Postol correctly says that the Oreshnik is not a nuclear weapon, this person does not dispute this, but the energy that the Oreshnik, because of the kinetic power, is able to exert on impact, that the kinetic energy is in some ways comparable to that of a low yield nuclear device, but that the energy is released in completely different ways, and the two are not analogous. By the way, I think that explains Putin's own confusion about this. Somebody explained to him, the scientists and the designers explained to him, that the kinetic energy would be the same, or roughly the same, as that of a low yield nuclear device. And Putin ran away with the idea that this is in some way, or at least the use of several of these Oreshniks together, would create the same effect as a nuclear device. And he said that, as I said previously, that particular hair racing, and it was based on a scientific misunderstanding. Now, this person, however, the person who I have received this email from, who I would like, by the way, to disclose who he is, and I would like to have an open discussion with him, perhaps in a program on the Duran, if he's watching, just to say, so that he can explain his position, his points clearly. Anyway, the point this person made is that in understanding the impact of an Oreshnik on a target, one should not just look at the surface damage. He says that Professor Postol underplays the surface damage that the Oreshnik causes. By the way, I didn't myself get that impression, not from Professor Postol's latest discussions of the latest Oreshnik strike. What Professor Postol was arguing was that the Oreshnik submunitions do not impact deep. They're not deep penetrators. But he wasn't saying that it wasn't a devastating area weapon. He was saying that the damage would be done to structures on the surface. The point this other person is making is that the kinetic impact of these submunitions hitting targets at such incredible speeds, the kinetic energy is going to make basically the ground shake, and that's going to affect structures deep underground, including bunkers, and that this is the way the Oreshnik does damage to underground structures. And that is, I have to say, very interesting. To repeat again, I'm not a physicist. As I said, I'd be very interested in having this person come to us to explain all of this. And maybe Professor Postol can react. I suspect that what we will find is that, as I said, these two very erudite people have many points in common. They both work within the same physical laws, and they both basically agree about those laws, and I think actually a consensus between them could be found. Anyway, I found this a most interesting discussion, and it may explain things about the effect of the Oreshnik that I have heard. I've received information that the Oreshnik strike on the Yuzhmash factory did indeed do substantial damage to the underground structures of that factory, making them unusable. And it could be that the same thing happened to the structure in Lvov. Anyway, let's discuss this, as I said, further. In the meantime, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, X and Substack. Please remember that you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel if you've liked this video. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.